Very excited today on the Outback Quarterback Podcast, a special edition episode. We've got Peter Bukowski from the Locked On Packers podcast, the biggest and best podcast, Packers podcast in the world. I've been referred, obviously, by our good friend Dos, the Packers Mad co-host of the Outback QB. Peter, we're very lucky to have you. We're going to talk free agency and draft, but firstly, welcome to the Outback Quarterback Podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. I wish I was getting to enjoy some Australian weather right about now, to be honest.
Well, we've come out of a pretty crazy heat wave here. I know it looks good on paper, but it's actually been too hot. So we've been complaining. You've been complaining. I'm sure that the ideal weather's somewhere in the middle. But I have to ask, before I say where everyone can find you, is this the first Australian NFL podcast you've been on?
I have to imagine it is, yeah.
Sweet. We're going to take that.
There we go.
It's normally a first for our guests. There aren't too many going around. We like to think we're the best one. But look, we'll get into the free agency and draft in a moment. But if you want to find Peter, and we'll say this at the end too, Locked On Packers is his podcast. The Leap newsletter, he writes about the Packers there. But also the Locked On Sports Today podcast is the All-American sports show. So baseball, basketball, everything your heart desires is there. But Dos, you take it away. You're the Packers man.
Peter, look, when this free agency, well, in the lead up to free agency, and it's always an exciting time for all fans of all 32 teams because it's a time when, extensions are going to get done, shiny new toys in free agency, everyone gets excited, and then once this sort of passes, everyone then looks to the draft at what next, because it's just seems to be society now. What's the next thing we can get? What's the newest thing? The Packers free agency underwhelmed probably a few fans and certainly a few of our listeners, and we had DMs when Aaron Banks was signed, Nate Hobbs was signed, thinking that the Packers didn't address wide receiver and they didn't address defensive line depth. But this goes back to the 2021 draft class by Brian Gutekunst, and I just want to get your take on why the Packers signed the players that they did in this free agency period.
Wow, that's there's a lot of things that go into that. You mentioned the 2021 draft, and I do think it starts there. When you have a draft class that ultimately long-term gives you nothing. Isaiah McDuffie is the only player, linebacker, that was a day 3 pick, is the only guy that you re-signed from that class. And that's not the only way to measure the value of a class. Like getting a player who's just a good rotational player in the 3rd or 4th round and then letting them walk in free agency can often be a good model to follow. Like John Runyon Jr. a couple of years ago, starting guard for the Packers, but wasn't going to pay them what the Giants were. And so they let him walk. Like he was a fine pick. But Eric Stokes, corner, he's not on the team anymore. They had to sign Nate Hobbs to fill the spot that Eric Stokes was supposed to fill. And then Josh Myers was the center in the 2nd round that they took over Creed Humphrey, by the way, Kansas City Chief All-Pro, and was a no-doubt Packers type, super athletic, experienced. Like, what are they doing? Not taking him. And I will always believe that it was Aaron Rodgers wanted a pro-ready guy, and they were a little more confident that a Big 10 guy would be more ready to step in versus a Big 12 spread center from Oklahoma, which is what Creed Humphrey was. And now you have to sign Aaron Banks. You're going to slide Elton Jenkins into center. Aaron Banks is going to be your left guard. And so now you are paying for the sins of draft classes past. And that's a difficult thing. Now, the good news here is usually when you take the collar on a draft, when the Packers took the collar on the 2015 draft, it ended the Mike McCarthy era. Like by 2018, they were so bereft of talent that they got a Super Bowl winning coach fired. You usually can't come back from this. So the fact that Brian Gutekunst, the general manager for the Packers, has been able to, on the fly, make this all work with the 2022 draft class the way that it was in the 2023 draft class. There's encouraging signs. 2024, Adrian Cooper looks like he could be a star player. Evan Williams walks in day 1 and looks like he could be. Now, I think week 3, week 4 was actually when he started. Javon Bullard was a day 1 starter for this team. We haven't even seen Jordan Morgan. We haven't even seen Marshawn Lloyd. Like this could be a pretty remarkable 3 set of draft classes that set them up. And the only way they're competitive now is because this free agency and Brian Gutekunst has been killing the draft the last few years.
When we talk about Aaron Banks, that's a name that we've sort of I think it's been a subject of almost mockery on our show for the last week or so, purely because of the dollars that are being spent, right? $78 million across 4 years. That certainly raised our eyebrows for a guard who has not been in the top tier of guards, maybe not even the top half across the league over the last little while. Why did they spend so much? Is it purely because of that flow-on effect? And is this something that it's just part of it? You have to overspend now, or is this a problem?
Well, it's both. I mean, when you're in free agency, you're going to have to pay the free agent premium. Like that's just the reality of free agency. It's rare that you do the thing that the Packers did last year and sign a top of market safety and he outperforms the deal. Yeah. Like signing Xavier McKinney for $17 million was sort of like, whoa. And then he was an all pro. That doesn't happen. The Packers struck lightning in a bottle in a similar way back in 2019 when they signed Zadarius Smith. And that was one of those like, holy crap. Can I curse on this show?
Yeah, you're right.
Signings. And he goes out and he plays like an all pro. That usually doesn't happen. But I think that's what go ahead.
Sorry to jump in. It normally doesn't happen except when you poach players from the Giants, McKinney, Barkley.
It turns out, when you can steal from bad teams, that tends to work. Like Josh Jacobs, bad situation in Las Vegas. You're coming through here. It's a little trickier with San Francisco, right? But we saw the Chiefs pay the backup tackle for the 49ers $15 million. So if that guy's worth $15 million, then their 3-year starter at guard has to be worth at least 15, right? So it's one of those things where I think if you'd have been fine with the deal at, let's say, 14 or 15, and I think I would have been, then really what's the difference? Like if it doesn't hamstring them for other players and you think he's going to be better for you, the Packers want to lean into more of these gap run schemes, power run schemes. The 49ers were still very much a wide zone, outside zone team. They wanted to do a little bit more of the power run game, and they did, but the Packers have really leaned into it with Josh Jacobs. And I think they envisioned someone like Aaron Banks, 26 years old, coming in, and your interior now with Elton Jenkins at center, with Sean Ryan at guard, and Aaron Banks at left guard. They want to move bodies inside, and they're happy to keep this, regional. They're happy to turn every run into a rugby scrum. Let just get behind those big dudes and let them try and push the pile. That's what the Lions do. It's what the Eagles do. You can create a run game if you can just move bodies like that, and you have a decent running back. That's the foundation for a pretty good run game.
Really playing to our East Coast listeners there, Peter, with a rugby reference. Dos.
Well, that's a good point on Josh Jacobs, because Josh Jacobs was signed last offseason in free agency, and many people raised their eyebrows at that because AJ Dillon was the one from previous draft class who, unfortunately, due to injury and hasn't panned out, and he's moved on. Well, and if you want to look at talent, and then also Aaron Jones last year for a brief period of about an hour or 40 minutes. Josh Jacobs and Aaron Jones were the backfield in Green Bay, and everyone was getting excited. And Aaron Jones has obviously moved on to Minnesota and then signed an extension, actually, just recently. Yep. So when fans are critical of Brian Gutekunst and his moves in free agency, you also need to step back, and you made a good point, Pete, on, well, free agency is about fixing mistakes that you made in the draft, more or less. And that's what teams realize. And then when you look at teams, the Patriots have got a lot of money in free agency to spend. The Raiders have got a lot of money to spend in free agency. Washington do. That is because for quite a long period of time, they have missed in the draft, and they have missed on quarterbacks. Now, Washington and New England have hit on their quarterbacks now, and we think, and they'll have the benefit of those rookie contracts. But there's a reason why bad teams have so much salary cap space to spend in free agency, and that's why you see the spend that we did with
you
those
don't
teams.
See good teams with a lot of money to spend in free agency for the exact reasons that you laid out. If you have a lot of money, it's because you have missed in the draft enough that you don't have any money to allocate to your own players. Yep. Most good teams are not capped out because they mismanage the salary cap. They're capped out because they've got too many good players to sign, usually, unless you're the New Orleans Saints and you are just like, you are doing mob accounting every year and I don't understand what your plan is. That's a different thing, and you're just going to kick the can down the road. But you look at the Eagles, like they lost Milton Williams, they lost CJ, or they gave up willingly CJ Gardner Johnson. And they're just like, we're fine. We're still going to be really good. And they did that because they didn't think that Milton Williams to them is worth $25 million, because he's not. He might not be worth $25 million in a vacuum, but if you're the Patriots, you got to pay the bad team tax. There's that part of this too, where if I'm going to come and play for you, I need a little bit more scratch because I don't want to suck. And so I think that's something that, we forget about oftentimes in free agency, like, oh, such and such a team has all of this money to spend. Okay. It would have been cheaper to have draft picks hit and then re-sign those guys, because you're not paying the free agent premiums. You're able to do it a year or two in advance, get ahead of the market, which is exactly why the Bengals find themselves in this disadvantageous position now, having to sign Jamar Chase to $40 million a year and T. Higgins $30 million a year. I don't understand what they're doing, because their draft, Jermaine Burton, can't play. Can't even make it to practice on time on a Saturday. Miles Murphy, who they used a first-round pick on recently, can't play.
Yep.
And Dax Hill doesn't play because he's been hurt. They don't know what position he plays. If you can't backfill your talent through the draft, you have to go out and spend in free agency. The problem for a team like the Bengals is they don't do that. They don't go and pay other teams' players in free agency, except very rarely. The one time they did it, guys, they went to a freaking Super Bowl. So I don't know what they're doing, but this is where they are. This is who they are. This is who they've always been. And this is why cheap teams struggle to win consistently in the NFL.
Well, it's a good segue, Peter, into the draft, because all of the mocks, or a lot of the mocks, seem to be saying that the Packers are targeting cornerback. There are some other needs as well. Where do you see them going? Do they stay at pick 23? Do they move around? What's the strategy for the Packers?
I mean, I could very much see them moving back. This is the kind of draft where you go, okay, the depth of the meat of this draft is really between 25 and 40. Or 50, like the difference between the 25th best player in this draft and the 60th best player in this draft is pretty small. So if you could pick up another pick in that range, or you have a player that you think is worth it, do you have a guy that you have a sort of top 15 kind of grade on that is there for you at 23? And what we always hear, right? I can give you the first line of every first round press conference. Well, we had him a much higher on our board. We couldn't believe he fell to us every single time. I just find that hard to believe that every single time, every single year, you were shocked that the guy who fits your needs perfectly, and it's just one of those funny things. And it's not just the Packers; every team does this.
Yep.
But I think all of those teams in the bottom, in the 20s, are going to be looking to move out. The problem is you have to have someone to trade with, and this is not a quarterback class. This is not a corner or receiver class. So what are you going to go up to get? And all those teams in the early 20s need pass rushers. Everyone needs pass rushers all the time. So to me, I'm looking at 23. I'm looking at 3 players for the Packers. Donovan Ezeraku, the defensive end from Boston College, 16 and a half sacks last year. The only defensive end at the combine to run a 3-cone below 7 seconds. If you don't know what that is, it doesn't matter. It's really good. You want pass rushers who can do that. And Jeff Hafley, the Packers defensive coordinator, coached and recruited him at Boston College. Vince Ogabazi, the assistant defensive line coach, was his recruiter at Boston College. So they have a pre-existing relationship there. The other 2 guys, Kenneth Grant, the defensive tackle from Michigan, he has not tested yet. When you see the numbers, you will go, holy, you know what? Because they're going to be eye-popping for someone 340 pounds. I think he got like 21 miles an hour or something crazy, running a guy down the field 40 yards, because he moves differently than guys at that size are supposed to move. And they believe in world theory. I don't know if your audience knows what that is, but the idea is God only made so many people on this earth who can move like that at that size. And so Brian Gutekunst at every press conference has brought up world theory. And so I'm just like, okay, I'm noting that with interest. Okay. Are they looking for more of these size speed freaks? Because that's what they love to do. And the last name I'll give you, Oregon's Derek Harmon. He's only 21 years old, was either the most productive or one of the 3 most productive pass rushers on the interior in college football last year. A preposterous win rate in true pass set situations, which is really indicative and projectable forward. And he played, and this is going to sound weird, played on the West Coast. The Packers' most trusted scout, Sam Seal, is their West Coast scout. They lean on him. If he says, hey, we got to take this guy, they're going to do it. And so I think that's one of those, like, just keep an eye on it. And Oregon, not in the Pac-12 anymore. They're in the Big Ten now. They play big boy football. They play Ohio State. They play Michigan. They play Wisconsin. They have to be able to defend the run in a meaningful way. They have to beat, these big time 5-star recruit offensive tackles in true pass set situations. So those are the three names that I'm watching for if I'm the Packers. And trading back, that's when I start to look at, can they get Jaden Higgins at like 36, 37, the receiver from Iowa State? Could they be interested in doing something like that? That would be pretty tantalizing to me.
All right, Dos, we'll let Peter go in about 1 minute. Is there one last thing as a Packers man, Packer to Packer, that you want to ask, or are you just have you taken all of your notes and you're ready to repeat them on our show?
No, I'm all good. I want to get from yourself, Peter. Who is your favorite all-time Packer? Whether it be from just watching them play or who you've got along with the most, maybe for any reason it could be. Who is your favorite all-time Green Bay Packer?
There's a look of fear in Peter's eyes when you ask that. That's a big question.
It's difficult. It's difficult to pick between all of my children. No, there's two names that jump out to me. And one is the obvious, Brett Favre. Just the joy that he played the game with, even understanding the post-career issues that you might have with him and that he might have with the law, unfortunately. If we set the person aside, the player on the field, he made me fall in love with football. There's no question about that. His joy for the game. I mean, I was in college when he retired, and I remember watching that press conference, and I am not ashamed to tell you, I wept when he announced that he was retiring, because this was someone that we had seen go through all sorts of things, play on a Monday night game right after his dad had passed away and play the game of his life. I mean, I'll never forget watching that game with my grandfather, who was also a diehard Packers fan, who shoveled snow at the Ice Bowl. And to have that guy, the guy that had the Iron Man streak, a streak that will be unbreakable. No one will ever start as many consecutive games as Brett Favre did. It will never happen. I promise you. To have that guy say, I don't know if I want to play anymore. That's heartbreaking. Like, my entire conscious life, he was the quarterback of the Packers. And one more name that I just have to throw out there is Robert Brooks, who was a receiver on those mid-90s Packers team, tore his ACL in 96 when they won the Super Bowl, came back in 97, was great again. I loved him. I went to his football camp a couple times, got to catch passes from him. That was a really cool experience. Actually got to meet Reggie White at his camp, the biggest human being I've ever seen. So Robert Brooks he's got to be second on the list if we're gonna go back to formative times.
And the question I always end our team-specific guests with is, what's the prediction for 2025? What's the record of the Packers and how far do they go?
The problem is this is a very difficult schedule. They have the AFC North out of conference. And so I think this is going to be tough. I mean, I think they could be a better team this year and still win 11 games. Like, I think 11 games would be a good number for Green Bay next year. Like, if they're an 11-win team, but they beat a couple of the good teams on their schedule that we worried about them beating last year, I think that would be big for them. I'd like to see how the draft plays out, because if they are able to add a meaningful piece on offense, I would be much more comfortable going 12. But this is going to be a brutal division, and their schedule's hard. So I think 11 wins is right where I would land, but I think they can be a better team this year than they were last year.
All right, that's Peter Bukowski, Locked On Packers. You guys know I'm a Chiefs man, but even I have found myself being drawn into the Locked On Packers podcast this week. That is true. I have been listening to it. It's great work. I know you listen to it all the time, Dos. It's really good. It is really good. So find Peter there, the Leap newsletter as well, Locked On Sports Today, the All-American Sports Show. Peter, we are very grateful. We really appreciate you coming on. You elevate the quality of our discussion, and we appreciate that. So all the best, and hopefully we can have you on again soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Peter.